Our mama died this morning, said the 5 children at his door in the snow. A lone widower opens his cabin to find 5 shivering orphans staring up at him, their mother gone, the storm howling behind them. He thinks it's just one night of shelter. But when the blizzard traps them inside, the cabin fills with voices, prayers, and secrets he never expected to hear. Then, out of a tattered bundle, the children reveal a hidden land deed one man would kill to control. Whispers of bloodlines, prejudice, and stolen water echo through the town. The rancher wants the land. The clerk demands proof. And the widower, scarred by loss, must decide if he will risk everything to keep these children together. A broken man, 5 abandoned lives. One deed that could change the fate of a valley. Will he turn them away or will he fight to become the father they so desperately need? Every story I share leads with love. For people, for healing. For the things we sometimes forget to say out loud. The bitter Colorado wind howled through the cracks of Noah Boone's cabin like a hungry wolf. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls that had stood silent witness to his solitude these past 5 years. His coffee cup clinked against the tin plate as he set down his meager breakfast. The sound echoing in the empty room. The pounding at his door came sudden and harsh against the pre-dawn quiet. Noah's hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped beside his chair, fingers curling around the familiar wooden stock. Few visitors ventured this high into the Colorado highlands, especially in the depths of winter. 1880. The knocking came again, more desperate this time. Noah crossed the creaking floorboards, boots heavy with caution. He drew back the iron bolts and pulled open the door, letting in a burst of snow-laden wind that nearly stole his breath. 5 small figures huddled on his doorstep, their shapes almost lost in the swirling white. The tallest, a boy no more than 13, stood at the front, his thin shoulders squared despite the violent shivering that racked his frame. Dark eyes met Noah's, carrying a weight no child should bear. Our mama died this morning, the boy stammered, his voice cracking on the last word. His arms were wrapped protectively around a little girl who couldn't have seen more than 5 summers, her face buried in his coat. Noah's heart seized in his chest, memories of another death, another winter morning, threatening to surface. He pushed them down, focusing on the 5 pairs of eyes staring up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Come in, he said gruffly, stepping aside. Out of this wind, at least. They shuffled in, tracking snow across his floor. Besides the oldest boy and the little girl, there were 3 others. 2 boys who looked to be around 10 and 8, and another girl of perhaps 7. Their clothes were thin, patched in places, and their faces bore the hollow-cheeked look of those who knew hunger well. I'm Thomas, the oldest boy said, his teeth still chattering. These are my brothers and sisters. We ... We walked from Mama's sod house before sunrise. Noah nodded, already moving to stoke the fire. Sit, he commanded, pointing to the chairs near the hearth. You're half frozen. The children huddled together near the flames, still wearing their coats as if afraid they might be sent back out at any moment. Noah filled his largest pot with water and set it to heat, then reached for the jar of beans on his shelf. It wasn't much, but it would fill their bellies. Your mama, he said carefully, measuring beans into the pot. She was sick? Thomas nodded, his arm still around his youngest sister. Since winter started, got worse last week. This morning His voice trailed off, and the little girl pressed closer to his side. Noah turned away, busying himself with the cooking to hide the emotion that threatened to break through his carefully maintained wall. He knew too well the sound of grief in a young voice, had heard it in his own when Sarah died. Taking their unborn child with her, the wind grew stronger as the morning wore on, rattling the shutters and driving snow through every crack. Noah kept the fire well fed, watching as colors slowly returned to the children's faces. He gave them hot water to drink, then bowls of beans when they were ready. They ate carefully, politely, though he could see their hunger in the way their eyes followed every movement of their spoons. Storm's getting worse, he said, more to himself than to them. The children tensed, and he saw Thomas straighten his shoulders again. "We can move on, sir, once it lets up a bit," the boy said, trying to sound stronger than his 13 years. "We just ... We didn't know where else to go. When Mama ... "You'll stay put," Noah cut him off, more sharply than he had intended. He softened his tone at their startled looks. "At least until the storm passes. Ain't safe out there now." Relief flickered across Thomas's face, though he tried to hide it. The younger children relaxed slightly, leaning against each other as exhaustion began to claim them. Noah found some old blankets in his trunk, laying them out near the fire where the children could rest. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of breaking. The wind screamed around the cabin corners, and the snow piled higher against the walls. Noah added wood to the fire, watching as the children huddled together under the blankets, whispering comfort to each other in soft voices. When night fell, he showed them to the loft where he kept his hay storage. It wasn't much, but it was warm. From the rising heat of the fire below, the children climbed up carefully, still moving like spooked deer, as if expecting to be turned out into cold at any moment. Noah lay in his own bed below, listening to the muffled sounds of crying from above. The soft sobs pierced through his carefully built defenses, reminding him of nights he'd spent alone, grieving for Sarah. He turned restlessly, troubled by memories he'd thought long buried. The youngest girl's quiet weeping sounded so much like Sarah's sister had that terrible night after the burial. The boy Thomas's determined strength reminded him of himself at that age, trying to be the man his own father had been. And their loss, fresh and raw as a new wound, stirred something in his chest he'd thought long dead. Sleep eluded him. As the hours crept by, the fire burned low, casting red gleams on the cabin walls. Above, the children's crying gradually quieted, replaced by the deep breathing of exhausted sleep. But Noah lay awake, his mind churning with unwelcome thoughts and memories. He'd built this life of solitude carefully, brick by brick, like the walls of his cabin. He'd chosen it after Sarah's death, finding peace in the simplicity of days measured only by sun and seasons. No attachments meant no risk of loss, no chance of having his heart torn apart again. But now these 5 children had appeared on his doorstep like abandoned birds blown in by the storm. Their need as clear as the grief. In their eyes, their presence had already begun to crack the walls he'd built around himself, letting in feelings he'd thought safely locked away. The wind continued its mournful song through the night, and Noah listened to the children's breathing, remembering. Another night of loss, another storm that had changed everything. He turned away from the world and seeking refuge in isolation. But now the world had come to his door in the form of 5 orphan children, and he found himself facing a choice he'd never expected to make. As the night deepened, Noah stared into the dying embers of his fire, troubled by the echoes of Sarah's voice in his memory. She had always believed in helping others, in opening their home to those in need. He'd shared that belief once, before grief had hardened his heart. The youngest girl whimpered in her sleep, and he heard Thomas's quiet whisper of comfort. The sound stirred something deep in Noah's chest, something he'd thought long buried under years of careful isolation. He rose quietly to add more wood to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow, pushing back the darkness for another hour. Dawn was still hours away, and the storm showed no sign of weakening. Noah settled back onto his bed, knowing sleep would continue to elude him. The children's presence had already begun to change something in his carefully ordered world, and he wasn't sure how to feel about that. For now, he could only listen to their breathing in the darkness, and wonder what tomorrow would bring. The storm showed no signs of letting up as morning light filtered weakly through Elias's frost-covered windows. If anything, the wind had grown stronger overnight, howling around the cabin corners like a hungry wolf. Elias rose early, as was his habit, to find 5 pairs of anxious eyes watching him from the loft. "Might as well come down," he said gruffly. "Storm's got us trapped for now." The children descended carefully, the oldest helping his siblings down the ladder. They looked uncertain in the morning light, as if unsure of their welcome. Elias noticed how the oldest boy kept the littlest ones behind him, like a shepherd guarding his flock. Need more wood for the fire, Elias said, moving toward the door. Come on, boy. You too. He gestured to the oldest and the middle boy. Outside. In the relative shelter of his lean-to woodshed, Elias showed them how to split kindling. Watch close now, he demonstrated, setting a piece of pine just so. Too thick, won't catch. Too thin, burns up too fast. His axe made a satisfying crack as the wood split clean. I'm Thomas, sir, the oldest boy offered, accepting the axe carefully. And this here's Jacob. Elias nodded, watching as Thomas attempted to split a piece. His form was awkward, but he had the strength for it. Jacob bounced on his toes, eager for his turn. Steady now, Elias cautioned as Jacob took his try. Respect the tool or it'll bite you. Back inside, the girls had attempted to tidy up. The blankets were folded with careful precision, stacked neatly in the corner. The oldest girl was attempting to quiet the fussy baby. Got some cornmeal, Elias said, moving to the stove. Make a proper breakfast. We ought to say grace first, the older girl said softly but firmly. Mama always insisted. Elias stiffened. Prayer was something he'd left behind years ago, along with other painful memories, but the girl was already bowing her head, her siblings following suit. Dear Lord, she began, thank you for this food and for Mr. She paused, looking up questioningly. Boone, Elias supplied reluctantly. For Mr. Boone's kindness, she continued. Please watch over us and help Mama's soul find peace. Amen. Amen, the others echoed. Even the baby seemed to sense the moment's solemnity. Elias found himself bowing, his head stiffly, memories of Sarah's morning prayers rising unbidden. She'd had that same quiet certainty in her faith thought as they ate their cornmeal mush. Elias learned their names. Sarah, the oldest girl, kept one arm around baby Martha while she ate. Ruth, the younger girl, watched him with solemn eyes, barely touching her food until Thomas encouraged her dot through the day. Elias found himself drawn into their routines, despite his determination to keep his distance. Sarah hummed hymns while she helped sweep the floor. Jacob proved surprisingly adept at tool work, his small hands steady as he learned to use the whetstone on Elia's old knife. Mama said I got a knack for fixing things, Jacob said proudly as the blade began to shine. Mind you don't cut yourself. Elias warned, but he couldn't help noticing the boy's careful attention to the task dot as evening approached. Sarah appeared at his elbow while he prepared a stew. I can help stir, she offered. Mama taught me how to keep it from sticking. Elias stepped aside, watching as she handled the wooden spoon with practiced care. The cabin had gradually filled with the children's presence, their whispered conversations, their small movements, their careful attempts to be useful. It was so different from his usual solitude that it made his chest ache with forgotten feelings. Once this storm clears, he announced to no one in particular, I'll take you all into town. Preacher Jenkins will know what to do. The children grew quiet at this, exchanging glances. Thomas straightened his shoulders, trying to look brave. But Elias saw how his hand tightened on Jacob's shoulder dot after supper. As Elias sat in his chair by the fire, little Ruth approached him hesitantly. Without a word, she settled beside him, her small head coming to rest against his arm. Elias sat frozen, unsure how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had sought comfort from him. The warmth of her trust, the simple weight of her head. Against his sleeve sent a crack running through the walls he'd built around his heart. He found himself remembering how Sarah had always said children were a gift from God, meant to remind adults of life's simple graces. The fire crackled in, the hearth casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, the space had transformed. Where silence had ruled for so many years, now there was the soft sound of children's breathing, the quiet murmur of their voices, the gentle humming of Sarah's. Elias sat very still, feeling Ruth's breathing grow steady as she drifted towards sleep. The crack in his armor widened, letting in feelings he'd thought long buried. But he held firm to his resolve. When the storm cleared, he would take them to town. He couldn't let himself be drawn back into a world of caring and loss. Yet as Thomas carefully lifted his sleeping sister and carried her to the loft, as Sarah tucked baby Martha into a makeshift bed, as Jacob proudly showed him the now gleaming knife, Elias felt the walls of his solitude beginning to crumble, one small stone at a time. Morning arrived with a pale, hesitant light that crept through the frost-rimmed windows of Yui's cabin. The glass panes wore delicate patterns of ice, like lace worked by nature's own hand. Elias stood at the window, coffee cup warming his weathered hands, studying the transformed landscape outside. The storm had finally passed, but it had left behind a world buried in white. Drifts rose like frozen waves against the cabin walls, and the familiar path to the barn had vanished completely beneath the snow's thick blanket. Even the fence posts that marked his property line were barely visible, their tops poking through like dark stitches in a white quilt. Elias set his cup down with determination. Storm or no storm, he needed to check on his Mare, Belle. She'd been patient in the barn these past days, and he reckoned it was time to ready her for the trip to town. The children couldn't stay here forever. Mr. Boone, Thomas's voice came from behind him. The boy stood at the bottom of the ladder, already dressed and ready for the day. I can help with the barn chores. Elias nodded, appreciating the boy's initiative. Put on an extra coat. It's bitter out there. Together they pushed open the cabin door. The snow had drifted nearly waist-high against it, and breaking a path to the barn proved harder than Elias had expected. Thomas followed in his footsteps, struggling through the deep snow, but never complaining. Inside the barn, Belle nickered a greeting. The Mare's breath made clouds in the cold air as Elias checked her over. Thought we might head to town today, he said, more to himself than to Thomas. Get you children somewhere proper. Thomas's face fell slightly, but he squared his shoulders. Yes, sir. I'll fetch our things. When they returned to the cabin, the other children were awake. Sarah had already started breakfast, standing on tiptoe to stir a pot of porridge on the stove. Little Ruth was helping Jacob fold the blankets they'd used while baby Martha sat wrapped in a shawl, watching them all with wide eyes. Trail's too deep, Elias announced gruffly. Won't be going anywhere today. He tried not to notice the relief that crossed their faces. Then we should get our things organized, Thomas said, moving toward the corner where they'd stacked their meager belongings. Mama made sure we packed careful before he stopped. Swallowing hard, Sarah moved to help him, and together they opened the bundle they'd carried through the snow. Elias watched as they laid out their possessions, some patched clothes carefully folded, a worn Bible with a cracked leather cover, and a folded paper that Thomas handled with particular care. Mama said this was important, Thomas explained, holding out the paper. Said we had to keep it safe. Elias took the document, unfolding it carefully. The paper was creased and slightly worn at the edges, but the writing was still clear. As he read, his eyes widened. It was a land claim, properly filed and recorded, for creek acreage, downstream prime water rights, and good grazing land. His hands tightened on the paper. He knew that stretch of land well. The railroad had been eyeing it for months, planning a new spur line through the territory. And Carson, the biggest rancher in the county, had been trying to buy up every piece of creek access he could get his hands on. Your mama filed this claim? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah nodded. She worked so hard for it, saved every penny from her washing and mending, said it was our future. Elias studied the document again. Everything appeared to be in order, the filing date, the survey marks, the official seal. These children weren't just orphans. They were legal heirs to one of the most contested pieces of land in the territory. Did your mama say anything else about this paper? He asked carefully. Just that we had to hold on to it, Thomas replied. That it was our chance for a real home someday. Elias folded the document and handed it back to Thomas, his mind churning. No wonder their mother had made them promise to. Keep it safe? That land claim would be worth fighting for, and there were plenty who'd fight dirty to get it. The day passed slowly, filled with small tasks. Elias showed Jacob how to bank the fire properly, while Sarah proved she could make a decent stew from their dwindling supplies. Ruth spent hours by the window, drawing pictures in the frost with her finger and naming the shapes for baby Martha. As evening approached, the temperature dropped further. Elias added extra logs to the fire, listening to the wind pick up outside. The children gathered near the hearth, huddling close for warmth. Mama always liked us to sing before bed, Sarah said softly. Said it kept our spirits up. Before Elias could respond, she began to sing, her young voice clear and sweet in the firelit cabin. The other children joined in, even little Martha, attempting to hum along. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like May once was lost, but now and found was blind. But now I see. Now I see. The familiar hymn filled the cabin, rising above the storm's howl. Elias stood in the shadows, his heart tight in his chest. The song brought memories flooding back. His Sarah, singing those same words while she worked, her voice full. Of faith and hope. He watched the children, their faces glowing in the firelight as they sang. They looked so vulnerable, yet they carried something precious, their mother's dream of a future, marked out in careful legal terms on that folded paper. A dream that powerful men would be more than happy to steal from 5 orphan children. Wind rattled the windows, making the flames dance and flicker. The children's voices rose stronger, as if to counter the storm's fury. Through many dangers, toils, and snares we have already come. Elias listened, rooted to the spot, as the last notes faded into the crackling of the fire and the endless moan of the wind outside. Dawn painted the sky in pale strokes of pink and gold. The storm clouds finally retreating toward the distant mountains. Elias stood in the knee-deep snow, adjusting the harness on his wagon team. His breath frosted in the crisp morning air as he checked each buckle and strap with practiced hands. Inside the cabin, Sarah helped bundle baby Martha in extra blankets, while Thomas and Jacob carried their meager belongings to the wagon. Ruth clutched her mother's worn Bible to her chest, watching the preparations with sullen eyes. "Time to get moving," Elias called, his voice gruff to mask the uncertainty. Felt daylight's precious this time of year. He lifted the children one by one into the wagon bed, which he'd padded with straw and covered with canvas to break the wind. Sarah settled in the middle, cradling Martha close, while the others huddled around them beneath wool blankets. Their faces were pale but determined, like young pioneers setting out for unknown territory. The wagon wheels creaked as they started down the trail. Breaking through fresh snow, Elias kept a tight hold on the reins, guiding the horses carefully around hidden obstacles. The going was slow, each mile a battle against winter's leftovers. Drifts had reshaped familiar landmarks, filling gullies and smoothing the rough edges of the land. "Look there," Thomas pointed mid-morning, indicating where a family of deer had crossed their path, their tracks like delicate stitches in the white blanket of snow. "They're heading for the sheltered valleys," Elias explained, grateful for the distraction from their difficult progress. "Smart creatures, dear. They know where to find food even in the worst weather." Baby Martha's cry pierced the cold air, despite Sarah's attempts to comfort her. The sound echoed off the snow-laden branches, making Elias's shoulders tense. He'd forgotten how a baby's wail could cut straight to the bone. By midday, the horses were struggling, their flanks steaming in the cold. Elias guided the wagon into a grove of towering pines where the snow lay thinner on the ground. The trees offered shelter from the biting wind, their branches creating a natural ceiling overhead. "We'll rest here a spell," he announced, helping the children down from the wagon, get some feeling back in our toes. Thomas and Jacob immediately began gathering dry branches for a fire, while Sarah found a relatively snow-free spot to change Martha's wrappings. Elias dug through his supplies and pulled out a pot and some beans, determined to get some hot food into them before continuing their journey. As the fire caught and began to crackle, Sarah started humming softly to Martha, bouncing the baby gently. In her arms, the melody drifted through the grove, and Elias froze, the pot hanging forgotten in his hands. He knew that tune. His Sarah had sung it countless times while working around the cabin, her voice sweet and clear as a mountain stream. "Your mama taught you that song?" he asked, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. Sarah nodded, still swaying with the baby. "She said she learned it from a kind woman who helped her when Thomas was born. Said it was the prettiest lullaby she'd ever heard." Elias turned away, blinking hard. His Sarah had been known for helping neighboring women during their confinements, sharing her knowledge and gentle spirit. How many times had she sung that lullaby to ease another mother's pain? The thought that her song had lived on, passed from one mother to another like a precious gift, made his chest ache. They ate their simple meal in the filtered sunlight beneath the pines. The children's cheeks grew rosy from the heat of the beans in the nearby fire. Even Martha settled, falling asleep against Sarah's chest, one tiny hand clutching her sister's shawl dot as Elias watched them. Memories surfaced that he tried for years to keep buried. The way Sarah had dreamed of filling their cabin with children's laughter, how she'd sewn tiny clothes in the evenings, hoping. The terrible stillness after they'd lost their only child. And then Sarah herself, within the same bitter winter. The afternoon wore on as they continued their journey, the wagon cutting a lonely path through the pristine snow. The children grew, quieter as exhaustion set in, though Thomas kept pointing out interesting sights to Ruth. A hawk circling overhead, a rabbit's track through the snow. The way ice had transformed a small waterfall into crystal columns, shadows lengthened across the snow, and the temperature began to drop again. Elias urged the horses on, knowing they needed to reach town before full dark. Finally, as the sun touched the western mountains, they crested a rise and saw smoke rising from chimneys in the valley below. The town's scattered buildings huddled together against the winter cold, and the church steeple stood tall against the darkening sky. Elias's hands tightened on the reins. The parsonage would be warm, he told himself. Reverend Matthews and his wife were good people. They'd know what to do with 5 orphan children. It was the sensible thing, the right thing. Then why did each step of the horse's hooves sound like his heart breaking all over again? They passed the first outlying houses, their windows glowing with lamplight. The children stirred under their blankets, peering out at the unfamiliar buildings. Baby Martha, as if sensing the tension, began to whimper softly. The church came into view, its white walls pale in the gathering dusk. Beside it sat the parsonage, smoke curling from its chimney in welcome. Elias drew the wagon to a halt, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him like a heavy cloak. Sarah's lullaby echoed in his mind, bridging the years between past and present. His Sarah's voice intertwined with the memory of these children's mother. 2 women he'd never known were connected, both trying to bring comfort to the little ones in their care. The wagon creaked to a stop before the white-painted church. Elias sat for a moment, his hands tight on the reins, before turning to help the children down. Their boots crunched in the fresh snow as they made their way to the parsonage door. Martha bundled tight against Sarah's chest. Reverend Samuel Harding answered their knock, lamplight spilling onto the porch. His kind face creased with concern as he took in the small group huddled before him. Come in, he urged, ushering them into the warmth of his sitting room. Mrs. Harding, would you put on some tea? The children clustered close to Elias. As he explained their situation, his voice low and measured. The Reverend listened intently, nodding at times, his eyes soft with compassion. A hard business, losing their mother in winter, Reverend Harding said, when Elias finished. He accepted the land claim paper, studying it carefully. This could be trouble, though. County Agent Wilkins has been particular about claim paperwork lately, especially with the railroad survey crews about. The paper's proper, Elias said, firmly. Their mother saw to it. Yes, but ... The Reverend hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Wilkins tends to find issues where certain folks are concerned. Their mother being half Apache ... What's that got to do with anything? Elias demanded, though he knew full well what the preacher meant. Nothing in God's eyes, Reverend Harding assured him quickly. But Wilkins answers to men who see things differently. Ruth pressed closer to Elias's leg, and he felt a protective anger rise in his chest. These were children, not some political issue to be debated by men in fancy offices. We need supplies, Elias said, gruffly, standing. Store will be closing soon. The general store bell jangled as they entered. Thomas helped Elias gather their needed items: flour, beans, coffee, and sugar. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, watched them with narrow eyes as he tallied their purchases. Two women by the fabric counter whispered behind their hands, their gazes fixed on the children. Elias caught fragments of their conversation. ... half dash breeds ... and ... should be at the agency ... A man lounging by the pot-bellied stove spat into a brass cuspidor. Right, he muttered loud enough to carry. Should send a lot of them to the reservation where they belong. Elias's jaw clenched. He wanted to turn and confront them, to defend these innocent children who'd done nothing to deserve such spite, but he knew from bitter experience that words rarely change such hearts. Instead, he counted out coins from his fur, trading money, careful to keep his movements measured and calm. Much obliged, he said coolly to Peterson, gathering their purchases. The children followed him silently, their heads down, shoulders tight. With tension they shouldn't have had to bear. The sun was setting as they made their way back to the parsonage, painting the snow in shades of purple and gold. Reverend Harding met them at the door, his wife hovering anxiously behind him. We've made up beds, the Reverend said. It's not much, but... No, Sarah cried suddenly, grabbing Elias' coat. The other children quickly followed suit, clinging to him with desperate strength. Martha, stirred by their distress, began to wail. Don't leave us. Ruth pleaded, her small fingers white-knuckled in the rough fabric of his jacket. Please, Mr. Boone. Elias felt their fear like a physical blow. These children had already lost too much, their father, their mother, their home. Now they faced losing the only security they'd found, however temporary it might be. There's a boarding house, he heard himself say. Might be better for tonight. Let them settle some before making changes. Relief flooded the children's faces. Even Martha's cries softened to hiccups. The Reverend nodded understanding, though Elias caught a glimmer of knowing in his eyes. Mrs. Warner's boarding house was warm and smelled of fresh bread. She clucked sympathetically over the children, leading them to a large room at the top of the stairs. 2 beds filled most of the space, with a trundle that could be pulled out for the younger ones. Elias paid for the night from his dwindling supply of coins, earned from months of trapping. It was worth it to see the children's shoulders finally relax, to watch Sarah settle Martha in a borrowed cradle while Thomas helped Jacob and Ruth arrange their few belongings. I'll be back tomorrow, Elias promised, his throat tight as 5 pairs of eyes fixed on him trustingly. You mind Mrs. Warner now? The ride home seemed longer than usual, the wagon lighter but somehow harder to bear. His cabin appeared through the trees, dark and unwelcoming. No smoke rose from the chimney, no lamplight warmed the windows. Inside. The silence pressed against him like a physical thing. The fire had died to cold ashes, and the air held a chill that seemed to reach into his bones. His footsteps echoed as he moved about, building up the fire, lighting the lamp, going through the motions of his solitary evening routine. The quiet that had once been a comfort now felt wrong, hollow. He missed the sound of children's voices, the scrape of chair legs on the floor, the soft whisper of bedtime prayers. Even Martha's crying had been better than this emptiness. Elias sat in his chair by the fire, staring into the flames. The cabin seemed to watch him accusingly, its shadows holding memories of laughter and warmth that had briefly filled its walls. He thought of the children in their boarding house room, hoping they'd found sleep despite their fears. Thought of the townsfolk's cruel words, of Wilkins and his particular ways with paperwork. The fire crackled and popped, but otherwise the silence remained unbroken. Elias had never felt its weight so heavily before dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Elias saddled his horse. He'd barely slept, the empty cabin weighing on his conscience through the long night. The Morris breath steamed in the cold morning air as they set out for town. Hooves crunching through fresh snow, Main Street was already stirring when he arrived. Shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, the blacksmith's forge glowing orange in the early light. Elias tied his horse outside the general store, planning to check the boarding house first. But movement near the parsonage caught his eye, a small figure in a faded blue dress, rocking back and forth on the front steps. His heart clenched when he recognized Sarah. She held Martha close, the baby bundled against the morning chill. And even from a distance, Elias could see the girl's shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Sarah?" he called softly, approaching. "What's wrong, child?" She looked up, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Oh, Mr. Boone." Her voice quavered. "The county agent came early this morning. He says we can't keep Mama's land." Elias knelt beside her, his joints protesting the cold. "What do you mean?" "He wants papers showing Mama and Papa were married proper." Sarah's chin trembled. "Says without them, the deed don't mean nothing." "But Mama never had papers. They was married Apache way before Papa died." Martha stirred, whimpering, and Sarah automatically began humming to soothe her, though her own tears still fell. The sight of the two sisters, one trying so hard to be strong, the other too young to understand their loss, made Elias's blood boil. "Where's this agent now?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite his anger. "Inside with Reverend Harding." Sarah wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Thomas is there too, trying to explain, but the agent won't listen." Elias straightened, his knee joints creaking. "You stay here with Martha. I'm going to have a word with." The parsonage parlor was warm, but the atmosphere inside was frigid. County Agent Wilkins sat primly in an armchair, his leather document case balanced on his knees. Thomas stood before him, fists clenched at his sides, while Reverend Harding hovered nearby looking troubled. "As I've explained," Wilkins was saying in a clipped tone, "without proper documentation of the marriage, I cannot verify hereditary. Claim to the land, it's a simple matter of procedure. Our Mama and Papa were married," Thomas insisted. "Just because it wasn't in your church, a legitimate marriage requires proper documentation," Wilkins cut in. "Otherwise, anyone could claim." "Anyone?" Elias's voice carried from the doorway, making them all turn. "Or just children with Apache blood." Wilkins adjusted his spectacles, looking down his nose at Elias. "Mr. Boone, this is an official county matter. It concerns 5 orphan children being cheated of their rightful property." Elias growled, stepping into the room. "Their mother worked that land, built a home there, raised her family there. Nevertheless, without proof of marriage. The proof is in those children." Elias's voice rose. "In the life their parents built together, in the deed their mother protected until her dying day." "Mr. Boone," Wilkins said, standing and clutching his case like a shield, "I understand you feel strongly, but regulations exist for a reason. Without proper documentation, I cannot. Elias took another step forward. "Or will not." Wilkins glanced nervously at the Reverend. "I must follow procedure. The railroad has expressed interest in that particular tract, and without clear title, Elias's quiet acknowledgement cut through the room like a knife. "Now we come to it. The railroad wants the land, so suddenly these children's claim needs extra scrutiny." Wilkins flushed. "That's not I mean to say." He gathered his dignity around him like a cloak. "The matter is closed unless marriage documentation can be provided. Good day, gentlemen." He hurried past Elias, who had to clench his fists to keep from grabbing the man's collar. The front door closed with a decisive click. "I'm sorry," Reverend Harding said into the heavy silence. "I tried to reason with him, but ... But he answers? To men who see things differently?" Elias finished bitterly. Remembering their conversation from yesterday, Thomas kicked the leg of a chair, then immediately looked ashamed. "Sorry, Reverend. It's just ... What are we going to do now?" Elias watched the boy, trying so hard to be strong, just like his sister outside. He thought of Sarah's tears, of Martha's innocent trust, of Ruth and Jacob's frightened faces when he'd left them at the boarding house. "You're coming home with me?" he said. Both Thomas and the Reverend stared at him. "Mr. Boone?" Thomas whispered. "Get your sisters and brother from the boarding house. Gather your things." Elias's voice was gruff but certain. "You'll stay with me while we sort this out, but your cabin's small, and we'd be such a burden." "You're no burden." Elias met Thomas's eyes steadily. "And we'll manage the space. Now, go on, daylight's burning." As Thomas hurried out, Reverend Harding stepped closer. "Elias, are you sure about this? Taking in 5 children is no small thing." "No." Elias watched through the window as Thomas hugged Sarah, saw both children's faces light up with hope. But leaving them alone would be worse. An hour later, they were loaded in Elias's wagon, their few belongings packed carefully behind the seat. The children sat close together, sharing warmth and comfort as the horse plodded steadily toward home. The late morning sun sparkled on the snow, and a crisp breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. Suddenly, Sarah's clear voice rose in song, an old hymn about God's faithfulness. One by one, her siblings joined in, their voices trembling but growing stronger together. Elias listened, something in his chest both aching and warming at the sound. The empty silence of his cabin seemed very far away now. His life had changed, had been changing since that first knock on his door during the storm. There would be challenges ahead, fights to face about the land and their right to it. But listening to those young voices raised in hope despite everything, he knew he'd made the right choice. The wagon rolled on toward home, their home now, while 5 children's voices carried on the winter air. And Elias felt the first real peace he'd known in years settle over his heart. The snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the world in white silence. Drifts piled against the cabin walls, and icicles grew longer by the day from the eaves. Inside, the cabin hummed with new life, though Elias sometimes found himself catching his breath at the strangeness of it all. "Hold it steady now," he instructed, watching Thomas adjust his grip on the wire trap. "You want it firm, but not so tight it'll snap back at you." Thomas nodded, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration as he bent the spring mechanism. His fingers, still small but growing, stronger, worked carefully with the metal. "Like this? That's the way." Elias felt a flutter of pride at how quickly the boy learned. Now the trigger plate needs to sit just so. From the corner of his eye, he caught Jacob watching intently. The younger boy had been following them around all morning, eager to learn everything his brother did. His attention made Elias think of other skills they'd need to know. "Jacob," he called, "fetch my rifle from the wall. Time you learned proper care of it." Jacob's eyes lit up. He hurried to retrieve the weapon, handling it with the careful respect Elias had already drilled into them. They gathered at the table, where Elias laid out his cleaning supplies: oil, rags, and the slender cleaning rod. "First rule of having a rifle is keeping it clean," Elias explained, showing Jacob how to check that the weapon was unloaded. "Frontier life depends on your tools working when you need them. That means patience. That means care." The boy nodded solemnly, watching as Elias demonstrated how to oil each part. His small hands moved tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as he worked the cleaning rod through the barrel. Sarah stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew that filled the cabin with the rich smell of rabbit meat and wild onions. She had taken to cooking with determination, though she often needed help reaching the higher shelves. The wooden spoon looked large in her hand, but she managed it well enough. "Mr. Boone?" she called. "Could you reach the salt for me?" He passed it to her, noting how she measured it carefully, just as he'd shown her. The stew had improved daily as she learned. His wife would have been proud of such a quick study, he thought, then pushed the pain of that memory aside. As evening drew in, Sarah pulled out the family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth with use. They gathered around the table after supper, lamplight casting warm shadows on the walls. Sarah opened to where they'd left off the night before, her finger tracking the words as she read. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began slowly. "I shall not want ... single quotes. She stumbled over certain words, looking to Elias for help. He found himself leaning in, explaining meanings he hadn't considered in years. The children's questions made him think anew about passages he'd long ago dismissed. "What does want mean here?" Sarah asked, frowning at the page. "Means need," Elias answered, his voice gentler than it used to be. "Says God will provide what we need." "Like he provided you for us?" Ruth's soft voice came from where she knelt by the hearth, carefully sweeping away the day's ashes. The simple faith in her words caught him off guard. He watched her small hands working with the brush, her movements precise and dedicated to her task. Even the youngest seemed determined to contribute to their shared life. The cabin had changed in these snowbound days, where silence had ruled. Now came the steady rhythm of multiple lives, boots on floorboards, quiet conversations, the clatter of cooking pots, and children's laughter. Even baby Martha's cries seemed to fill the space with life rather than disruption. But in quiet moments, doubt crept in like the winter chill. Elias would watch them at their tasks. Thomas with his traps, Jacob learning the rifle, Sarah cooking, Ruth sweeping, and fear would grip his heart. What right did he have to play at being their father? He was just a rough mountain man, too long alone. The county agent's words echoed in his mind, reminding him how fragile their situation remained. The light faded outside, and Sarah closed. The Bible. The children knelt for their evening prayers, a ritual they hadn't abandoned despite their losses. Ruth's small voice led them. "Now I lay me down to sleep, ... Elias stood in the doorway between the main room and his bedroom, watching. The lamplight caught their bowed heads, cast shadows of their clasped hands on the floor. Their faces showed such trust, such certainty in God's care. His chest ached with a familiar pain. But different now, not the old grief of loss, but a new fear of losing what he'd found. These children had worked their way into his life like spring thaw into frozen ground, changing everything they touched. The thought of the county taking them, of returning to his solitary life, cut deeper than he'd expected. Thomas glanced up, catching his eye, and Elias saw his own uncertainty mirrored in the boy's face. They were all afraid of losing this newfound family, this warmth they'd built together. The boy's look seemed to ask, "Will you fight for us?" Elias gave a slight nod, and Thomas's shoulders relaxed. They would face whatever came together. For now, the snow fell outside, keeping them safe in their small world, while inside, the cabin glowed with the light of family restored. The children's prayers continued, their voices mixing in the warm air. Elias remained in the doorway, silent, guardian of this precious moment, his heart full of both fear and fierce protection. Whatever the county might say, these children had become his own. He just prayed he would prove worthy of their trust. February's chill bit deeper than January's had. The winter stores in Elias's cabin, normally enough for one man, dwindled faster with 6 mouths to feed. He watched the flour barrel empty and the salt pork shrink until one morning, counting their supplies, he knew they couldn't wait any longer. "Thomas," he called, finding the boy splitting kindling by the woodpile. "Hitch up the wagon. We need to make a town run." Thomas's face brightened at the prospect of an adventure. Though only 13, he worked with steady purpose, helping Elias load the wagon with pelts they'd gathered over the past weeks. His hands, though smaller than Elias's, showed growing confidence with the leather harness as he helped prepare their old mare. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as they set out. Thomas sat straight beside Elias on the wagon seat, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The boy had grown these winter months, not just in height, but in bearing. He carried himself more surely now, though Elias noted how his shoulders still tensed when they approached town. "You remember what we need?" Elias asked, giving Thomas the chance to prove himself. "Yes, sir," Thomas nodded firmly. "Flour, salt, pork, candles." And Sarah asked if we might find some thread. She's mending Jacob's shirt. Elias nodded, pleased at the boy's attention to detail. The wagon creaked through the last stretch of trees, the town's buildings coming into view ahead. Smoke rose straight from chimneys in the still air. and the telegraph office's wire hummed with its constant clicking. They pulled up outside the general store, where Elias helped Thomas secure the mare. Inside, the store's wooden floors creaked under their boots as they approached the counter with their bundles of pelts. The shopkeeper, Mr. Wilson, examined their furs with practiced hands. "Fine work here," he commented, sorting through the pelts. "The boy help with these?" "Some," Elias answered, noting Thomas's proud straightening beside him. "He's learning." They bartered the furs for their needed supplies: 2 sacks of flour, salt pork wrapped in brown paper, a bundle of tallow candles, and the thread Sarah had requested. Thomas carefully counted each item as they loaded the wagon, his dedication to the task warming Elias's heart despite the winter chill. "Need to check on one more thing," Elias told Thomas, eyeing the saloon across the street. "Wait here with the wagon." But Thomas followed him to the saloon steps. "I want to come with you." Elias studied the boy's determined face. He saw fear there, but also courage. "All right," he agreed. "But stay close." The saloon's interior was dim after the bright snowlight outside. Tobacco smoke hung in layers near the ceiling, and the wood-burning stove in the corner cast out waves of heat. Elias approached the bar, meaning only to ask about mail he was expecting regarding the children's situation. That's when he heard the voice behind him, smooth as snake oil, and just as toxic. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man playing daddy." Elias turned slowly. Clay Mortimer stood there, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as different from the other men in the saloon. The rancher's face wore its usual expression of amused contempt. "Mortimer," Elias acknowledged coldly, feeling Thomas press closer to his side. "Heard you're still harboring those half-breed squatters," Mortimer drawled, his eyes flicking to Thomas. "Foolish thing, giving them false hope about that land claim." Elias's hand tightened on the bar, his knuckles whitening. "Their mother's claim is legal." Mortimer laughed, the sound empty of real humor. "Legal? That land belongs to Progress. Old. Man, railroad's coming through, and I've got contracts to honor. Those brats will be scattered to the winds once the county agent sees sense." Thomas trembled against Elias's side, but his young voice rang out clear. "It's our land. Our mama said, 'Your mama's dead,'" Mortimer cut in cruelly. "And that land will be mine, one way or another." Elias felt the fury rise in his chest like a tide. His hands itched to teach the rancher manners, but Thomas's presence held him in check. Instead, he placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder and turned him toward the door. "We're done here," he said, his voice level despite his rage. "Run along then," Mortimer called after them. "But remember what I said. Those children won't be your concern much longer." Outside, in the sharp winter air, Thomas burst out. "He can't take our land, can he, Mr. Boone?" Elias helped Thomas up onto the wagon seat before climbing up himself. He took the reins in hands that still wanted to form fists. "No need to fear him," he said firmly, though doubt gnawed at his gut. "We'll sort this out proper and legal." The ride home was quieter than their morning journey had been. Thomas sat lost in thought, and Elias could almost hear the wheels turning in the boy's mind. The sun was setting by the time they pulled up. To the cabin, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Sarah met them at the door, little Martha balanced on her hip. Her smile faded as she saw their faces. "What happened?" she asked, showing wisdom beyond her 11 years. Inside, as they unloaded their supplies, Elias explained about Mortimer's threats. The other children gathered round, their faces solemn. Jacob's hands clenched into fists much like Elias's had wanted to, while Ruth pressed close to Sarah's skirts. "But we can't let him take the land," Thomas protested. "It's all we have left of Mama." Elias set the flour sack down heavily. "I'll speak with the lawyer in Cedar Junction next week. We'll fight this proper." "We don't need to fear," Sarah said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. She shifted baby Martha to her other hip, looking at each of them in turn. "God won't forsake us. He brought us to Mr. Boone, didn't he? He'll see us through this too." Elias looked at her in surprise. Such certainty in one so young. It unsettled him. His own faith had withered years ago, yet here was this child, standing straight and sure in the face of their troubles. Her quiet confidence somehow made his own doubts seem smaller. The other children nodded at Sarah's words. Drawing closer together, even Thomas's worried expression eased somewhat. Elias watched them, the children who had lost so much yet kept their faith. Sarah's eyes met his, and he saw in them not blind trust, but a deep, unshakable conviction. He turned away to store the salt pork, uncomfortable with the stirring in his heart. The threat of Mortimer and his railroad men loomed large in his mind, along with the count agent's continuing reluctance to recognize the children's claim. Yet Sarah's words echoed in his thoughts. God won't forsake us. As evening drew in, and the children settled to their usual tasks. Sarah cooking, Thomas tending the fire, the younger ones at their chores. Elias stood at the window, watching. Darkness claimed the snow-covered land. He didn't share Sarah's certainty about God's care, but looking at these children who had become his family, he knew one thing for sure. He would not forsake them, whatever came. February softened into March, and with it came hints of spring's promise. The iron grip of winter loosened gradually, bringing days when the sun's warmth could be felt through the chill. Snow still blanketed the ground, but patches of earth began showing through where the sunshine lingered longest. Elias watched from the cabin door as Thomas and Jacob wrestled with fence posts along the eastern edge of the property. The boys had grown stronger over the winter months, their bodies adapting to the daily work of frontier life. Even from this distance, he could see the improvement in their technique. They knew now to brace their feet just so, to lift with their legs instead of their backs. Mind you set those posts deep, he called out. Spring thaw's coming and the ground will shift. Yes, sir, Thomas answered, wiping his brow despite the cool air. Jacob just nodded, already positioning the next post. Sarah's voice drifted from behind the cabin where she tended to their small flock of chickens. She was singing softly, some hymn her mother had taught her, while little Martha toddled after her, trying to help scatter feed. The chickens had been Elias's idea, traded from a neighbor for some of his winter pelts. The fresh eggs made a welcome change from their winter diet, and caring for the birds gave the children a sense of purpose. Ruth appeared at his elbow, carrying the water bucket. It was still too heavy for her to manage alone, but she insisted on trying. Elias automatically reached down to steady it. Much obliged, she said seriously, mimicking his own manner of speaking. The phrase brought an unexpected smile to his face. Together they carried the water inside, Ruth's small boots keeping pace with his longer stride. She had grown too, he realized, not just in height but in confidence. No longer the trembling child who had arrived at his door that bitter morning. She moved through the cabin with quiet sureness, knowing her place and her tasks. The days had found their rhythm. Mornings began with Sarah reading from their mother's Bible while the others ate breakfast. Elias would assign the day's work. Wood to chop, water to haul, lessons to learn. The children took to their tasks with varying degrees of enthusiasm but growing skill. Even little Martha had her job, following Ruth around with a rag to help clean. Elias found himself taking pleasure in teaching them. He showed Thomas how to read weather signs in the clouds and wind. He taught Jacob the patience needed to repair tools properly. Sarah learned to make soap from rendered fat and lye, her face serious with concentration as she stirred the mixture. Ruth discovered she had a way with the chickens, who would eat from her hand while they scattered from others. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Elias caught himself smiling at their progress, at their small triumphs and determined efforts. The cabin had changed too. Where once there had been only bare necessity, now there were signs of life. Sarah's careful, stitching on a patched quilt, Jacob's whittled figures lined up on a windowsill, Ruth's collection of pretty stones arranged on the mantel. That evening, as they gathered for supper, the cabin glowed with lamplight and warmth. Sarah had managed. A decent stew from their stores and the fresh bread she'd baked filled the air with its homey scent. Thomas and Jacob had worked hard on the fences all day, and their healthy appetites showed it as they dug into their bowls. Elias watched them all, Thomas and Jacob discussing their fence-mending progress. Sarah helping Martha with her spoon, Ruth carefully breaking her bread into pieces. The scene stirred something in his heart, something he thought long buried with his wife. Then Ruth looked up from her bread, her dark eyes serious in her small face. "You're our pa now, aren't you?" The question fell into sudden silence. Even Martha's babbling stopped as all eyes turned to Elias. The spoon in his hand froze halfway to his mouth. His throat tightened. The word pa echoed in his mind, bringing with it a flood of memories. The child he and his wife had lost. The years of lonely grief that followed. He looked at the 5 faces watching him, saw hope and fear mingled in their expressions. "Best eat before it gets cold," he managed roughly, dropping his eyes to his bowl. The meal continued in awkward quiet, broken only by the clink of spoons and Martha's occasional murmur. As soon as they finished, the children climbed to their sleeping loft, their usual evening chatter subdued. Elias heard them settling in above, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of blankets, the whispered prayers Sarah always led them in. When silence finally fell, Elias remained in his chair. By the fire, the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as he sat, lost in thought. His eyes drifted to the shelf where his wife's Bible lay. He hadn't opened it since her death. Couldn't bear to see her careful notes in the margins, the pressed flowers she'd kept between his pages. Rising slowly, he took the Bible down. Dust had gathered on its leather cover, and he wiped it away with gentle fingers. The book fell open to a familiar page, where pressed violet still held its color after all these years. His wife had loved violets, would gather them in spring. To brighten their cabin, Elias traced the dried flower with one callous finger. He remembered the day she'd picked this one, how she'd smiled as she tucked it into her Bible. They'd been talking about having children of their own, making plans for the future. But that future had crumbled to dust, leaving him alone with his grief. Yet now there were children sleeping under his roof. Children who needed him, who looked to him for protection and guidance. Children who had begun to heal something in him he'd thought forever broken. Ruth's question hung in the air. "You're our pa now, aren't you?" The fire popped and settled, sending up a shower of sparks. Elias sat holding his wife's Bible, caught between the weight of past loss and the unexpected. Gift of present love. Above him, one of the children turned in sleep, making the floorboards creak softly. He remembered his wife's last words to him. "Don't let your heart die with me. Elias, promise me you'll keep it beating." He had made that promise, though he hadn't known how to keep it, until now. Until 5 orphan children had appeared at his door, bringing life and warmth back to his frozen world. A tear fell onto the Bible's worn cover. Elias wiped it away carefully, his hand trembling slightly. The question of being their pa wasn't just about him anymore. It was about these children who had lost so much, who needed the security of belonging somewhere, to someone. The fire burned. Low as Elias sat, wrestling with his heart, the Bible warm in his hands, while above him 5 children slept in the home they had made together. The first whispers of spring crept into the Colorado highlands. Snow began retreating from south-facing slopes, revealing patches of muddy earth beneath. Tiny streams trickled down the mountainsides, joining the swelling creek that cut through the valley. The morning air still carried winter's bite, but by afternoon, the sun brought hints of warmth. On a bright Sunday morning, Elias hitched the wagon while the children dressed in their best clothes, carefully mended and pressed by Sarah's diligent hands. Thomas helped the younger ones climb aboard, settling them on clean blankets in the wagon bed. Baby Martha, wrapped snugly against the morning chill, sat in Sarah's lap, her dark eyes bright with excitement. The wagon wheels creaked as they made their way down the mountain trail. Patches of ice still lingered in shadowed hollows, but the path had mostly cleared. Jacob pointed out new signs of spring. A lone crocus pushing through melting snow, the first robin they'd seen that year. Ruth's voice lifted in delight when they passed a flowering serviceberry bush dot as they approached town. Other wagons and riders joined them on the road, all heading toward the white-painted church. Elias felt the familiar tension creep into his shoulders. He hadn't attended services regularly since his wife's death, and bringing the children meant facing the town's scrutiny head on. They pulled up beside the hitching post, and Elias helped the children down. Sarah straightened Ruth's collar and smoothed Martha's dark hair before they climbed the church steps. Inside, lamplight glowed on polished wooden pews and brass fixtures. The children's boots echoed on the plank floor as they filed into a row. Near the back, no sooner had they settled than the whispers began. Elias heard them clearly enough, murmured comments about the children's copper dark skin and black hair, their mother's Apache blood. Some spoke with mere curiosity, others with poorly concealed disdain. A woman 2 rows ahead shifted pointedly, away when Ruth smiled at her. Thomas's jaw tightened, and Jacob stared straight ahead, his small hands clenched in his lap. But Sarah sat tall, baby Martha quiet in her arms, her face serene as she opened their mother's Bible. Elias found himself straightening too, drawing strength from her quiet dignity. Clay Mortimer sat near the front, his broad shoulders rigid, in his fine Sunday coat. When he turned to look their way, his face darkened with barely contained anger. The rancher's ambitious plans for the railroad's expansion hadn't included dealing with 5 half-Apache children holding a valid land claim. Reverend Harding moved to the pulpit just then, his kind face grave as he surveyed his congregation. The whispers died away as he opened his Bible. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes and golden beams as his strong voice filled the church. "Today, brothers and sisters," he began, "we turn to the book of James, chapter 1, verse 27. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the pews. Scripture tells us that pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Elias felt Sarah grow very still beside him. The Reverend continued, his voice gaining power. We are called not just to pray, but to act. Not just to speak of God's love, but to show it. When orphans stand in need, when widows suffer want, our duty is clear. His eyes found Mortimer. We cannot claim to love God while turning away from his children, all his children. The message struck home. Heads bowed in reflection, and several women dabbed at their eyes. Even some who had whispered earlier now looked ashamed. But Mortimer stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the floor. Without a word, he strode down the aisle and out the door, letting it bang shut. Behind him, Reverend Harding never faltered. Let us pray, he said quietly, for open hearts and willing hands to do God's work. The rest of the service passed peacefully. When it ended, several townspeople approached to greet them. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, pressed the paper-wrapped loaf into Sarah's hands. Old Mr. Jenkins actually tipped his hat to Thomas. The children's faces brightened at these small kindnesses. The sun had climbed high by the time they started home. The wagon swayed gently as they followed the creek road, its water singing with spring melt. Ruth had fallen asleep against Jacob's shoulder, and Martha dozed in Thomas's arms. Sarah sat beside Elias on the driver's seat, her mother's Bible in her lap. Mr. Elias? She asked softly after they traveled some distance in comfortable silence. Yes, Sarah? Do you reckon God still hears prayers? Even if ... She hesitated. Even if someone hasn't talked to him in a long while? Elias's hands tightened on the reins. The question hit close to wounds he'd carried since his wife's death, since he'd turned his back on faith in bitter grief. He'd avoided prayer, avoided church, avoided any thought of God's presence in his life. But these past months with the children had awakened something in him, something he'd thought long dead. He'd seen Sarah's unwavering faith light there. Darkest hours, he'd watched Thomas pray for strength to help provide for his siblings. Jacob asked God's blessing on their meals. Ruth sing hymns while doing her chores. Their simple trust had begun to soften his hardened heart. Double quotes he started, then cleared his throat. I don't really know, Sarah. Been a long time since I gave it much thought. He paused, choosing his words carefully, but I'd like to think he does. Maybe ... that maybe I'd like to find out again. Sarah's smile was soft as spring sunshine. Without a word, she leaned against his arm, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. Together they watched the trail ahead, where new grass pushed through melting snow and the first butterflies of the season danced in warming air. The wagon rolled on toward home, carrying its precious cargo of sleeping children and awakening hope. Above them, church bells still echoed from the valley, their clear notes rising like prayers into the endless Colorado sky. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elias's land when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the peaceful air. Elias had been showing Thomas how to mend a broken fence post, while Sarah hung laundry on the line with Ruth's help. Jacob sat nearby, whittling a piece of pine wood, and baby Martha played with wooden blocks on a blanket in the grass. At the sound, Thomas's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing. Elias straightened, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Thomas's shoulder as 5 riders appeared around the bend in the trail. Clay Mortimer led the group, his black stallion prancing beneath him. Behind him rode 2 men in city suits, railroad men by their look, and 2 local ranch hands. "Stay with your sisters," Elias murmured to Thomas, who nodded and moved quickly to gather the younger children. Sarah scooped up Martha, holding her close as they clustered near the cabins. Mortimer reined his horse to a stop, dust rising around the animal's hooves. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, Boone," he called, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake in the sun. "Mortimer?" Elias stood his ground, watching as the men dismounted. The railroad men brushed, trail dust from their suits, looking out of place against the rustic backdrop of the cabin and surrounding wilderness. "These gentlemen represent the railroad's interests," Mortimer said, gesturing to the suited men. "Mr. Harrison and Mr. Webb. They've brought some papers I think you'll want to see." The taller of the 2 men, Harrison, stepped forward, pulling folded documents from his breast pocket. "We have here legal documentation of the railroad's prior claim to the Creek lands," he announced, his eastern accent sharp against the mountain air, "including the portion currently occupied by these ... children." Elias's jaw tightened. That land belongs to them. Their mother left them the deed. "Ah, yes." Webb, the shorter man, smiled thinly. "About that. We've conducted a thorough search of territorial records. There appears to be no documentation of a legal marriage between the children's mother and their purported father. Without such proof, they cannot be considered legitimate heirs to the property." Behind Elias, he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. The cruelty of their words hung in the air like smoke. "Those children have suffered enough," Elias growled, his hands clenching into fists. "Their claim is honest. Their mother worked that land for years." Mortimer swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the earth with a thud. "The law's the law, Boone. Without proof of marriage, they're just squatters, and squatters can be removed." "Are you threatening children now, Mortimer?" Elias took a step forward, fury rising in his chest. "Just stating facts." Mortimer's eyes glittered. "Railroads coming through, one way or another. That creek access is vital for the new line. Better accept it now than make things ... difficult." Harrison held out the papers. "We'll be filing these with the county court tomorrow." "The sheriff will be notified of the situation?" "You can expect official notice of eviction within the week," Webb added, straightening his vest. "I suggest you make arrangements to relocate the children before then. Perhaps the Indian Agency would be willing to take them." A sound like a wounded animal came from behind them. Elias turned to see Ruth crying silently, her small shoulders shaking. Jacob had wrapped his arms around her, his own face wet with tears. Thomas stood rigid, fists clenched, while Sarah pressed Martha's face against her shoulder, as if to shield the baby from the men's cruel words. "Get off my land." Elias's voice was deadly quiet. "Now," Mortimer's smile widened, "your land?" "Thought. You were just sheltering them out of the goodness of your heart, Boone. Getting attached, are you, to half-breed orphans?" Elias moved so fast even Mortimer flinched, taking a step back. "I said get out. Before I forget, there are children watching. The ranch hands shifted nervously, hands moving toward their gun belts. But Mortimer waved them back, still smiling that snake smile. No need for violence. We've said our piece. Sheriff will be along soon enough. He swung back into his saddle, the others following suit. Enjoy your time playing family while you can. Boone. Won't last long. They rode away, leaving only dust and devastation in their wake. As soon as they disappeared around the bend, Ruth broke into loud sobs. Sarah sank to her knees, still holding Martha, while Jacob and Thomas rushed to Elias's side. They can't take us away, Thomas pleaded, grabbing Elias's arm. Can they? Elias looked down at the boy's desperate face, seeing the same fear in all their eyes. His heart ached with the weight of it. Without proof of their mother's marriage, the law would side with Mortimer and the railroad. The children would lose everything. Their land, their home, each other. Inside, he said quietly. All of you. It's getting cold. They huddled together in the cabin as evening fell. Sarah tried to cook supper, but no one had any appetite. Ruth wouldn't stop crying, and even baby Martha seemed to sense the heavy despair that filled the room. Jacob sat in the corner, sullenly, whittling his piece of wood into smaller and smaller pieces. Thomas paced like a caged animal, while Sarah whispered prayers under her breath after the children finally fell into exhausted sleep in the loft. Elias sat alone by the dying fire. The enormity of their situation pressed down on him like a physical. Wait, he had promised to protect them, but how could he fight the railroad, the law, and Mortimer all at once? How could he keep them safe when everything was stacked against them? For the first time since his wife's death, Elias felt truly helpless. The bitter taste of defeat filled his mouth as he stared into the glowing embers. He had turned his back on faith years ago, when grief had overwhelmed him. But now, with 5 innocent lives hanging in the balance, he found himself sliding from his chair to his knees. Lord, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, I know I ain't spoken to you in a long while. Turned my back when I should have. Turned to you. But these children ... quotes. His voice broke. These children need help I can't give. They need your wisdom, your strength. I'm begging you, Lord, don't let them suffer for my failures. Show me a way to protect them. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias turned to find all 5 children standing there in their nightclothes, watching him with wide eyes. Before he could speak, Sarah stepped forward, kneeling beside him. Her small hand found his shoulder, warm and steady. One by one, the others joined them. Thomas knelt on his other side, Jacob and Ruth pressing close, while Sarah held Martha in her free arm. Together, they formed a circle of joined hands and bowed heads. Our Father, Sarah began softly, her voice strong with faith. We know you haven't forgotten us. Even when things look dark, you're still there. Please help Mr. Elias find a way to keep us together. Help us be brave, like Mama taught us to be. The children whispered in unison. Elias felt their hands on his shoulders, their simple trust surrounding him like a warm blanket. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed flowed freely now as they knelt together in the firelight, 5 small hearts joining his in desperate prayer for deliverance outside. The wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the darkness, a whippoorwill called. Inside the cabin, hope flickered like the last flames of the fire, small but refusing to die out completely. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Elias rode back from town. His shoulders slumped with defeat. Reverend Harding had searched every church record, but found nothing to prove the children's mother had married their father. The empty saddlebags felt as heavy as his heart as he rounded the final bend toward home. Elias spotted a familiar figure, waiting by his cabin door. Henry Red Elk sat straight-backed on the front step, his weathered face peaceful in the morning light. The children clustered around him, listening intently as he spoke. My friend, Henry called out as Elias dismounted. I have been waiting. These little ones tell me of your trouble. Henry. Elias clasped the older man's offered hand. I don't know what to do. Without proof of marriage, they'll lose everything. A gentle smile crossed Henry's face. I was there, brother. At their wedding, 7 summers passed. He reached into his leather vest and withdrew a beaded band of blue and white. Their mother gave this to me before she fell ill. Said I must keep it safe, that someday it might be needed. Sarah gasped, reaching out to touch the delicate beadwork with trembling fingers. Mama's wedding band, she whispered. I will speak truth before any judge, Henry said firmly. Tell what I witnessed that day. The children erupted in joyful cries. Sarah threw her arms around Henry's neck, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in days, hope blazed bright in Ilias's chest. The county courthouse buzzed with tension as townsfolk packed the wooden benches. Clay Mortimer lounged near the front, a confident smirk playing across his face. County Agent Wilkins shuffled papers at his desk, peering over his spectacles with obvious skepticism. Henry Red Elk stood tall despite his years, his voice clear and strong as he recounted that long-ago wedding day. I watched them join hands beneath the cottonwoods, he testified, holding up the beaded band. They spoke their vows before the Creator and these mountains. Reverend Harding stepped forward next, his Bible clasped tight. These children are legitimate heirs, he declared. Their mother was a woman of faith, their father honorable. The land is rightfully theirs. Wilkins cleared his throat, glancing between the marriage band and his documents. The testimony appears. Conclusive, he admitted reluctantly. The claim stands. Mortimer slammed his hat on his head and stormed out, boot heels echoing. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, several women wiping tears. Elias stood, gathering the children close. Before God and this community, he announced, voice thick with emotion, I aim to adopt these young ones proper. They're mine now, and I'm theirs. Sarah buried her face in his coat, while Thomas grinned proudly. The townsfolk's applause grew, louder, and Reverend Harding beamed his blessing. Warm sunshine bathed the creek banks as Elias and the children worked the soil together. Their hoes turned dark earth while meadowlarks sang from nearby fence posts. Thomas and Jacob dug furrows in neat rows, while Sarah carefully dropped bean seeds into the rich dirt. Gently now, Elias instructed, showing Ruth how to cover each. Seed with just enough soil. These'll feed us come harvest time. The potato patches took shape under their combined efforts, and baby Martha watched from her blanket in the shade. Giggling at butterflies dot in the evenings, the cabin glowed with warmth and life. Sarah's clear voice carried through scripture passages, while Elias's knife shaped wooden horses and dolls from pine blocks. The younger children gathered close, eyes bright with wonder at each new toy emerging from his skilled hands. One evening, as purple shadows stretched across their land, Elias stood in the doorway. The children pressed around him, their familiar, weight against his legs bringing comfort. Golden lamplight spilled past them into the yard, and his mind drifted to that bitter winter morning when 5 shivering orphans had appeared on his doorstep. Now, their laughter filled every corner of his home, his family, his heart full to bursting. Elias bowed his head. Thank you, Lord, he whispered, meaning it with all his soul. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here where love speaks softly and stays.